Last night, Grant came home drunk, shattered the porcelain vase my husband left behind, then grabbed my shirt and shook me as if he wanted to unload every bitterness he carried onto this old body. When I told him, "Let's talk tomorrow," he screamed, shoved me into the edge of the table, and my head hit hard enough to make my vision spin. I lay on the floor, blood at the corner of my mouth, while he walked away like I was nothing. And yet this morning, I still got up and made breakfast like usual, my hands shaking as I tried to act calm. Grant came downstairs with bloodshot eyes, ready to yell, but then he looked out the window and saw Mrs. Rhea standing there. His face drained immediately. I didn't understand why, but in that moment, I knew a truth was about to be dragged out of the dark. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey, and if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like, so it can reach even further. I stood in the kitchen for a long while, one hand on the counter to steady myself. My whole body still ached, especially my back and shoulders. Every time I turned too quickly, it felt like someone was twisting a rope between my joints. After Grant went upstairs last night, I sat on the kitchen floor for nearly 10 minutes, trying to catch my breath and sweep up the broken pieces of the vase my husband cherished most. We bought that vase in Charleston for our 20th anniversary. I had kept it intact for decades, until last night. When I opened my eyes this morning, sunlight came through the bedroom window and made me squint, and the side of my head pulsed immediately. I touched my temple and felt a swollen lump. I slowly sat up, careful not to make any noise, afraid the sound might make Grant's door fly open with one of his usual outbursts. I put on my beige knit cardigan, the kind older women in New England wear on chilly mornings, then wrapped a light scarf around my neck to hide the bruised skin. Walking down the stairs, each wooden step creaked, as if reminding me this house had witnessed far too much of what should never happen between a mother and the son she raised. In the kitchen, I opened the fridge and grabbed eggs, butter, a bit of bacon, and sandwich bread. Familiar motions helped calm me. The sound of a hot pan, butter melting, the scent of coffee mixing with toast. Those were the small things that made me feel like myself again, if only for a few brief minutes. I didn't expect an apology. Grant hadn't apologized for anything in years. Every tantrum was a mistake, every outburst just stress, every disrespectful act. Not a big deal, you're overreacting. For months, I told myself this phase would pass, that Grant just needed time to get back on his feet after losing his job. But last night crossed every boundary I had ever quietly tried to draw. Heavy footsteps on the stairs pulled me back to the moment. Grant appeared, hair a mess, eyes red, face marked with exhaustion. He stopped at the last step, watching me put eggs and bacon on the table. "Again with this?" he muttered, his voice rough from alcohol. I didn't respond. I rarely did in the mornings. Silence was always safer with him before he sobered up. He walked toward the table and pulled out a chair, but before he sat, his eyes glanced toward the left window and then froze. I followed his gaze and saw someone standing still in the front yard. Mrs. Rhea. I recognized the neatly tied silver hair, the navy coat, and the sharp eyes of a woman who always seemed to know more than she said. Rhea had been my neighbor for nearly 10 years. Steady, kind, private, a former Army nurse with a firm spine and a good heart. She rarely involved herself in anyone's affairs, unless she saw something she couldn't ignore. Grant jerked upright like someone had stabbed him. "What is she doing here?" he whispered, voice trembling, not with anger, but fear. It was the first time in months I'd seen real fear in my son's eyes. A big, strong, temperamental man like Grant afraid of a 72-year-old woman simply standing outside. I watched him closely. Grant gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. He turned his face away, avoiding my eyes, like one question from me would shatter him. I'm going out, he stammered, then rushed upstairs, nearly hitting the railing. I watched his shadow disappear around the stairwell, and something uneasy rose in my chest. Rhea remained outside, motionless. She didn't look at the window or at my house. She just stood there, facing the street like she was thinking. I pulled the curtain slightly and looked out. Under the soft morning light, my yard looked like a peaceful Connecticut autumn scene. Leaves scattered across the grass, dew on the railing, a white fence lining the walkway. So quiet it made last night's chaos feel like a bad dream, if not for the throbbing lump on my temple, reminding me it was real. Rhea finally turned, meeting my eyes through the glass. She didn't smile. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp, as if she had seen everything I'd tried to hide for years. My throat tightened. Why had she shown up today? And why had Grant looked terrified? I heard Grant slam his bedroom door upstairs. I walked back to the table and sat down. My hands were trembling again. The whole house felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I tried to inhale deeply, but my chest stung. Rhea still didn't leave. Something about her quiet presence unsettled me more than Grant's rage the night before. It felt like she was waiting, or that she knew something. Eventually, she picked up her purse and walked back toward her house, each step slow and steady, like she carried a secret neither Grant nor I was ready to hear. I stood, gripping the counter to stay steady. One thing was certain. This morning was the beginning of something far bigger than a drunk man's outburst. The image of Rhea standing silently in my yard circled in my mind like a sign, a warning. Didn't yet understand, but I knew I had to. No matter what truth was coming, it was heading straight toward me. And it all began with the fear on Grant's face the moment he saw an old woman standing outside the house he thought he controlled. A truth was about to be dragged out of the dark, and this time I couldn't pretend not to see it. After Grant stormed upstairs and slammed the door, I stood alone in the kitchen, confused and shaken. I tried rearranging a few plates, but my hands trembled so hard I dropped one, the clatter echoing sharply through the room. I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. The house felt too quiet, too heavy, like the air had thickened. I decided to clean up breakfast to calm myself, but I couldn't swallow a single bite. I was about to tidy the counter when the heavy front door swung open. Grant left without a word. The stale smell of alcohol lingered long after the door slammed shut. I stood there until I heard his car start and fade down the road. The house sank into a silence so deep I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, each second falling heavy onto the wooden floor. I had barely taken a breath when 3 knocks sounded at the door. Firm, steady, not loud, but enough to make me jump. I knew who was standing there before I even touched the knob. When I opened the door, Rhea stood there, silver hair tied back, navy coat zipped up, eyes sharp enough to see straight through me. "Eleanor," her voice was low, firm, but warm. "I came to see if you're okay." I opened my mouth to say I was fine, but the words caught in my throat. The left side of my head still throbbed, and the scarf couldn't fully hide the swelling. I steadied myself on the door frame, avoiding her gaze. I'm fine," I whispered, "just a little tired." Rhea stepped one foot onto my porch, as if she didn't believe a word. Last night I heard Grant yelling from the yard. The living room window was lit. I saw something fly out, looked like a picture frame. I lowered my head. I remembered exactly when the picture of my husband crashed to the floor while Grant flung his arms around. I had protected that photo for years after my husband died, only for it to shatter in seconds. I dropped it, I muttered. Rhea wasn't having it. "Eleanor, I'm not deaf and I'm not blind. I saw Grant throw things out the window. I saw him yelling in your face, and I heard a bang loud enough to wake half the street if they weren't already used to this house." I lifted my head on impulse. "No, Grant was just drunk. He didn't mean it." Rhea crossed her arms, her expression softer but unwavering. "You think I've never heard those lines before? I spent 20 years as an army nurse. I've seen plenty of people insist they're fine when they clearly aren't." I clutched the edge of my cardigan, silent. I'd spent so long hiding everything, not because I didn't know it was dangerous, but because admitting it hurt more than the violence itself. Admitting it meant accepting that my son could truly harm me. Rhea met my eyes and spoke clearly. "I know what your son is doing." The words hit like a hammer, heavy, direct, impossible to dodge. I inhaled sharply. She didn't stop. I don't like interfering in people's homes, but last night I saw enough. I forced a small smile. Grant's under pressure. He lost his job. Then his ex-wife sued him. Everything's piling up. I just need to help him through it. I didn't finish. She shook her head and placed a hand gently on my arm. Helping a child who's struggling is one thing. Enabling abuse is another. I pulled my arm back, not out of fear, but because the truth stung too sharply. Rhea sighed, reached into her purse, and handed me a folded sheet. I opened it. A hotline for elder abuse assistance. The state service for Connecticut. She must have cut it from one of the brochures the town hands out every year. I think you should have this. I shook my head immediately. No, that's not necessary. This is my home and Grant is my son. I can't call numbers like this. I bit my lip. I didn't want to finish with, he'll lose control. Rhea's eyes softened, full of sympathy, not judgment. I know what motherly love looks like. I have a son too, but sometimes, she paused, then said each word slowly, some children don't need more love. They need boundaries. My heart tightened painfully. I didn't want that to be true of Grant, but it was. She continued, her voice quieter. If you don't draw a line, he will keep doing this. And next time, it may not just be a bump on your head. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I folded the paper quickly and slipped it into my coat pocket, as if hiding it might erase everything. Thank you, Rhea, but I'm really fine. Grant's just overwhelmed. She studied my face for a long moment. Finally, she stepped back, but before turning away, she said something that froze my blood. Grant is about to do something worse. I don't know what, but I can feel it. Be careful, Eleanor. Then she walked off the porch, down the stone path, and disappeared beneath the shaded street lined with trees. I stood in the kitchen, my fingers brushing the folded paper in my pocket. My heart pounded, not because I feared Grant at that exact moment, but because I knew Rhea didn't speak lightly. I leaned against the counter to steady myself, the image of her standing outside earlier, calm, firm, like someone who had seen too much, replayed in my mind. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what worse thing she sensed, but my instincts told me it wasn't small, and in that moment a painful truth struck deep. The peace I'd clung to for years had begun to crack. The cracks weren't hiding anymore. They were spreading fast. I stood at the window looking out at the empty yard. Last night's storm was only the opening act. Something bigger was coming. I felt it the way you feel a cold draft slip under a door, and I knew I had to be ready. After Rhea left, I stayed in the kitchen for a long time, as if my legs no longer obeyed me. Every word she'd spoken echoed in my mind. Grant is about to do something worse. It wasn't an offhand warning or a dramatic guess. It sounded like the judgment of someone who had seen men pushed to their breaking point. And I knew Rhea never spoke without certainty. I sat down in the wooden chair by the table, my hands clasped together. Morning light streamed through the window in long stripes across the surface. But inside me, it felt like a gray winter afternoon. I needed to think clearly, but my mind was tangled, and the only way to untangle it was to step back, to look honestly at everything that had been happening. In recent months, Grant had become someone I barely recognized. He'd been unemployed for over a year, claiming he lost his job at the factory because of conflicts with management, though his explanation grew shakier each time he gave it. He'd slipped into a pattern, waking late, drinking coffee, then sinking into the sofa with his eyes glued to the TV. By noon, it was beer. By night, bourbon. Every day the same, wearing him down, and me along with him. Some evenings, I'd pass the living room and see him sprawled out, feet on the table, fast food wrappers scattered on the floor. If I gently reminded him to clean up, he'd snap back, like, I want to live like this, Mom? I would retreat, telling myself it was better not to push him. There were many times he borrowed money from me, always with reasons that sounded important. Online investments, a business opportunity, just clearing a small debt. I believed him, at least in the beginning. I thought he just needed one good push to get back on his feet, but that push never came. Every dollar I handed him never returned, and every promise of, don't worry, Mom, I'll pay you back, became emptier as time passed. One evening, I heard him mumbling through the haze of alcohol. "Who do you think is supporting who? I'm the one stuck with you." The words stunned me, but I convinced myself it was just the alcohol talking. But there was one sentence I could never forget. "If you don't sign, you'll see what happens." At the time, I thought it was just anger spilling out. I had no idea that sentence would become a threat I'd carry through many sleepless nights. And now, sitting alone in the kitchen, those words rose up clearer than ever, like a cold blade sliding across my skin. For months, Grant barely did a thing around the house. The trash would overflow so badly the lid couldn't close, yet he walked past it without a glance, clothes piled at the bottom of the stairs. When I reminded him, he snapped. "If you're free, then do it." A simple sentence, but each time it cut a little deeper. Repeated enough, it became a fracture. The house that used to be peaceful when my husband was alive had turned into a place filled with slammed tables, shouting, and blame. Grant lost all restraint when he was angry. He hurled the TV remote at the wall, threw beer cans on the floor, and knocked things over whenever something wasn't the way he liked it. The first time he smashed a plate I was washing just because I didn't answer fast enough, I froze, tears falling before I even noticed. I always covered for him. When neighbors asked, "Is Grant doing okay?" I forced a smile and said, "He's looking for a new job." When friends checked in, I said, "He's just stressed." I hid everything, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want anyone to know my son was becoming someone I barely recognized. Last night wasn't the first time Grant lost control, but it was the first time he scared me so much I didn't dare breathe too loudly. I still remember the way he looked at me, anger mixed with resentment, like every failure in his life was my fault. I tried soft words to calm him, but that only made him explode more. When I said, "Let's talk tomorrow," something inside him ignited, and he lunged forward and shoved me with cruel force. Standing at the window this morning, watching Rhea walk away, I realized last night wasn't an isolated outburst. It was the culmination of a whole year of things I had tried to ignore. I didn't want to face the truth because admitting it meant accepting that I had lost Grant, or at least the good part of him that once existed. Now, when Rhea said, "Grant is about to do something worse," I knew it wasn't a guess. It was a conclusion drawn from everything she had seen, from a clearer, more objective distance than mine. I stood up from the table and walked slowly across the living room. The floor still bore the evidence of last night's fight. Books scattered off the shelf, fragments of the picture frame across the rug, a sofa cushion on the floor. I picked the pieces up one by one, my hands trembling non-stop. I suddenly remembered all those times Grant sat on the sofa, eyes bloodshot, chewing cold pizza. I stood behind the chair gently and asked, "Would you like to get a mental health checkup?" "I think you..." He cut me off. "Shut up, I'm not crazy." I backed away instantly. Maybe the most painful part wasn't his behavior. It was how many signs I had ignored. I told myself he was just going through a tough period, that if I cooked him good meals, if I lent him a little more money, if I stayed quiet and patient, everything would be fine. But day by day, I felt like someone trying to balance on thin ice. I stepped softly, but the cracks kept spreading. Every one of Grant's outbursts was a new fracture, and after last night, I knew that ice was about to break completely. I returned to the table and sat down. I could hear the occasional passing car or a bird on the porch roof, but in my mind, there was only Grant's voice. "If you don't sign, you'll see what happens." The sentence returned with 10 times the weight it had when he first said it. Back then, I thought it was just reckless anger. But now, with his debts and everything I had pieced together, the words felt terrifying. I lowered my head into my hands and closed my eyes. And for the first time in years, I admitted something I had never dared admit. Grant was no longer the son he used to be. I had lost the good part of him, or he had lost it himself. As for me, I was still here, clinging to a version of him that had vanished long ago, realizing that hurt deeply, but maybe it was the first step in saving myself. And as I stood up, I knew more clearly than ever. I couldn't keep my eyes closed any longer. I sat quietly for a long time as months of memories and warning signs poured in. My mind was still tangled like a ball of yarn clawed apart by a cat, but one thing became clear. I couldn't just sit there waiting for things to get worse like Rhea warned. I had to understand what Grant was truly involved in. That afternoon, when Grant wasn't home, I went upstairs to his room. I had avoided stepping inside for ages because each time I opened that door, I remembered the child he used to be, the one who drew robots on paper and hid cookies under his pillow. But his room now was a different world. As soon as I opened the door, the mix of stale alcohol and days-old sweat hit me. The dim light from the window fell across the mess. Clothes in a heap at the foot of the bed, beer cans rolling on the floor, the desk covered with papers and fast food wrappers. I looked around, feeling like I had stepped into a life I no longer recognized. I only meant to look for something small, but when I glanced at the desk, I saw a thick folder, half hidden under an old magazine. The edge of the folder showed red numbers, enough to make my heart skip. I pulled it out, set it on the bed, and opened it. Inside were overdue notices, delinquency warnings, payment demands. The amounts were so large I had to place a hand on my chest to steady my breath. Credit card debt, personal loans, even documents from a high-interest lender, all in Grant Whitmore's name. When I reached the final pages, my stomach dropped. It was a set of documents related to a real estate mortgage. My house, but what terrified me wasn't the mortgage itself. It was the fact that my name was missing from every page. No signature, no consent, no mention of me at all, even though the house had been in my name since my husband passed. I had to sit on the edge of the bed. The folder felt like a stone on my lap. I realized Grant wasn't just spiraling, he was desperate. And in that desperation, he was willing to do something I never imagined, force me to sign the house over to save himself from bankruptcy. A tightness rose in my throat. This was my home, the house my husband and I bought with a lifetime of savings, where I planted every flower bed, where his pictures hung. It was where I wanted to spend the rest of my life, yet Grant, my only child, saw it as a last-ditch escape from his own failures. I closed the folder, my hands still shaking. That afternoon, once the shock settled, I went to see Rhea. I thought I was just stopping by, but I knew I needed answers. Rhea opened the door before I even knocked. She looked at me like she'd been expecting me. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, not accusingly, but gently, like someone who'd seen this pattern in many households. "I found Grant's debt files," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "and the mortgage papers. My name isn't on anything." Rhea nodded slowly, not surprised. I assumed as much. I stared at her. "You knew something?" She folded her arms and stepped back so I could walk inside. She pointed toward the window facing my yard. "3 days ago, I saw Grant talking to a man, a stranger, right on your lawn." "What kind of man?" I asked, my breath quickening. "A man in his 50s, big build, leather jacket, not someone who drops by for friendly chatter." She sighed. "I can't prove it, but I think he was a debt collector, or someone forcing him to sign something." I gripped the arm of her chair, trying to stay steady. Part of me wanted to run from everything I was hearing, but another part knew this was the truth I had to face. Rhea placed a hand on my shoulder. "A man backed into a corner can do terrible things, Eleanor. I've seen too many." A chill went through my whole body. I didn't want to believe Grant could push me into danger, but one day earlier, I also didn't believe he could slam me into a table and leave me bleeding. Reality didn't need my permission to get worse. That night, when Grant came home, I tried to talk calmly. I needed to know what he was planning. I asked softly in the kitchen, "Grant, you need to tell me what's going on with the house." He froze. "Did you go into my room?" His voice dropped low, an icy tone that made my skin prickle. "By accident," I answered, trying to stay calm. "I just wanted—" "Not your business." He cut me off, eyes glued to his phone, but his hand tightened around it, veins rising on his skin. "That house belongs to me," I said, my voice firmer than it had been in years. "And you know it." Grant slammed his phone onto the table, making me flinch. He stepped close, so close I could smell the leftover alcohol on his breath. "You don't understand." He spoke slowly, each word heavy. "This house hasn't been yours for a long time." I stepped back, but kept my eyes on him. That wasn't anger talking. It was a declaration from someone who believed he had the right to take what wasn't his. I knew then Grant wasn't hearing me anymore. He was drowning in debt, alcohol, and the belief that I was in his way. I understood how he'd gotten there, but understanding didn't make it safe. When he stormed upstairs, I leaned against the counter, my breathing uneven. Arguing with him now would only make things worse. I had to do what Rhea said. I had to gather evidence, quietly, silently, without letting Grant know. I started cleaning the living room, but my hands were no longer shaking. A quiet strength rose inside me, like Rhea's words had lit a fire I hadn't felt in years. I couldn't save Grant from his bad decisions, but I could, and had to, save myself. And that night, for the first time in years, I wasn't the mother stepping back to avoid the waves. I began to fight back, silently, steadily. I knew the road ahead would be hard, but I also knew I wasn't alone anymore. Not when the truth had finally begun to show itself. If you're still listening to this story and felt your heart sink hearing the words, "This house hasn't been yours for a long time," please tell me where you're watching from in the comments, or share even a small thought, just so I know we're still walking through this together. That night, after Grant said, "This house hasn't been yours for a long time," and went upstairs, I stood alone under the soft yellow kitchen light, gripping the edge of the counter to stop my hands from shaking. I knew I couldn't keep living in denial. Grant had crossed a line into a darkness too deep for both of us, and if I stayed still, he'd drag me into that darkness with him. I knew one thing clearly. I had to save myself. When the sound of his footsteps faded upstairs, I walked quietly into the living room, my heart pounding like I was doing something wrong. But the only wrong thing happening in this house wasn't coming from me. It was everything Grant was planning to force me to sign. I opened the small drawer under the TV cabinet where I kept odds and ends, loose batteries, a recipe notebook, a few pens, and a tiny voice recorder I used years ago when taking notes for my husband's medical care. It had been sitting there untouched, old but still working. I switched it on, heard a familiar soft beep, and knew this was exactly what I needed. I placed it behind a stack of cooking guides on the shelf near the sofa, right where Grant usually sat to make his phone calls. I sat down, adjusted a bit of the speaker wire to hide the part sticking out, then stood up feeling both guilty and relieved. Guilty because I had to do this to my own child. Relieved because at least I was finally regaining some control over the situation. The next day, when Grant left the house, I returned to his room to finish gathering evidence. I opened the door slowly, afraid the old hinges would squeak too loudly. The room was just as messy as the day before. I opened the thick debt folder I had only skimmed, and this time I photographed every page with the old phone Grant didn't know the password for. I held the phone close to each sheet, trying to keep my hands steady. Page after page filled with negative balances, red stamps reading, "Past due, final notice," and payment demands within 48 hours. Every time I pressed the shutter, my heart tightened. But I knew I had to do it. No one could help me if I didn't protect myself first. When I was done, I put all the papers back exactly where they had been, so Grant wouldn't suspect a thing. Then I gathered every original document I had found, a fairly thick stack, took it downstairs, and put it into an old metal box I once used to store spare change. I locked the box, walked out to the backyard, and headed toward the old oak tree, the one my husband had tended to like a beloved child. The March wind in Connecticut was still cold. Dry leaves crackled under my feet as I reached the tree. I knelt, took the old garden trowel, and dug a shallow hole just deep enough to bury the metal box. As I covered it with soil, it felt as though I were burying a part of my life. Years of trust, years of hope poured into a son I barely recognized anymore. But I knew I couldn't back away from this moment. In the days that followed, I watched Grant silently, like he was a stranger living in my own house. I tracked his routine. When he left, when he drank, when he made calls. I became alert to every noise, every shift in his tone. Grant grew more volatile by the day. It was as if he carried a ball of fire and hurled it at anything nearby. Some days he yelled because the pull tab on a beer can got stuck and threw the whole can onto the floor, beer splattering everywhere. Some days he slammed his hand on the table because the TV remote couldn't find a channel. The sound of things breaking became a regular soundtrack in the house. I said nothing. I just watched from a distance as he slipped deeper into his own chaos. One afternoon while washing dishes, I heard Grant's voice from the living room. He was on the phone, tense as a pulled wire. I know, I'm working on it. I'll get the signature before the end of the month, okay? Stop calling. I froze, my hand gripping the dish towel. My heart felt like it could burst out of my chest. The signature, that was my signature. And before the end of the month, that meant someone was pressuring him. The strange man Rhea had seen. He was likely the one pushing Grant to the edge. That night, when Grant left the house, I turned on the recorder. The recording was long, but it captured every angry, petty, desperate word Grant spat into the phone. I sat on the sofa with the recorder in my hands, tears spilling as I listened to my son falling into a pit he refused to climb out of. The next day, I decided to see a lawyer. I needed professional advice to understand where I stood in this fight. On the corner near the town hall was a small but reputable law office, one many people in town had mentioned. The lawyer was a woman in her 60s with prematurely silver hair and bright, steady eyes. She invited me to sit, poured me tea, and listened quietly as I told her everything. When I finished, she set her cup down, looked at me for a long moment, and asked, "Have you signed any documents related to the house?" "No, absolutely not," I answered, my voice trembling a little. She nodded and jotted a few notes. "Then there is hope. But you must be careful. If Grant is trying to force your signature, that means he's under enough pressure to do something unpredictable." My throat tightened. What should I do? She spoke slowly, clearly. "First, under no circumstances sign anything, even if he says it's for insurance, home repairs, or anything harmless. Second, prepare a plan to leave the house if Grant becomes violent. Third, if you feel threatened, call the police." I lowered my head, my hands clasped together. I never wanted to call the police on my own son. Her eyes softened. "I know that hurts, but sometimes, to save both of you, the law has to intervene." I knew she was right, yet I felt something hollow inside, as if someone was erasing the warm memories I had held on to for so many years. When I returned home, I stood at the door with my hand on the lock, but didn't turn it right away. I took a deep breath, as if stepping into my own house now meant stepping onto a battlefield. I walked into the living room, sat on the sofa, and looked around. Everything. The painting I had hung, the glassware my husband and I chose when we were young, his old clock, held beautiful memories, but scattered among them were the marks of Grant's destruction, the evidence of uncontrolled rage. I knew, from here on, every action I took had to be deliberate. I could no longer be soft-hearted. I could no longer cling blindly to the hope that Grant would change on his own. I began writing a list of what to do if he became violent again, finding a place to stay, calling the police, protecting the evidence, each step forming clearly in my mind. When I put the pen down, I understood. The real battle was about to begin, and this time, I wasn't stepping back. That night, the sky was swallowed by thick gray clouds. Wind hissed through the window cracks with a sound like a long, weary sigh. I tried going to bed early, but my heart wouldn't settle. I tossed and turned, my mind spinning with the lawyer's words, the debt papers buried under the oak tree, the recording of Grant's furious voice. Around 11 p.m., the neighbors' lights were all out, and the street was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the hallway clock outside my bedroom. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep could lift the weight on my chest, but then a motorcycle engine roared in the yard, slicing through the night like a blade. I shot upright instantly. Seconds later, pounding shook the front door, loud, violent, rattling the frame. Grant's voice echoed, hoarse and soaked in alcohol. "Mom, open the door!" I was wide awake. My hand flew to my chest as my breath quickened. I ran to my bedroom door, locked it, and pressed my back against it, my heart slamming against my ribs. Grant kept pounding harder each time. "You have to sign, do you understand? You have to sign!" His voice cracked, a mix of rage and panic, an awful sound that chilled me more than any blow ever had. I stepped back toward the bed and grabbed my phone, but my hands shook so badly that my fingers slipped across the screen again and again. I tried opening the emergency dial, but my fingers felt stiff, unresponsive. Grant kicked the door. The whole frame shuddered as if one more strike would rip the hinges off. I said, "Open the door!" His voice rose like an injured animal, hurt and vicious at once. I gasped, "Grant, stop it!" But he didn't listen, or maybe he couldn't tell my pleading apart from the wind. I could feel the wooden panels straining under each blow. I pressed my back against the wall, gripping the phone, still unable to hit a single number. Just when I thought the door would burst open, a bright white light flashed through my bedroom curtains. The yard light snapped on. I heard Grant freeze, then a heavy, breathless silence, and then a woman's voice, the one I had known for years. "Stop right now, Grant." Ria's voice rang out clear, firm, unwavering. I rushed to the window, pulled the curtain aside, and the sight nearly made my knees give out. Under the harsh yard light, Ria stood beside the post, holding up her phone, pointed straight at my front door. Her silver hair blew lightly in the wind, but she stood like an unmovable oak. Grant turned toward her, eyes wide like he'd seen a ghost. What are you doing here?" he yelled, but his voice shook, thin and choked. Ria didn't answer right away. She stepped forward, still holding the phone steady like undeniable proof. "I'm recording everything," she said, her voice so calm it made the scene even more frightening. "And I have called the police." I watched Grant's shoulders drop, as if someone slapped him back into reality. He looked around, then back at Ria. For a moment I thought he might lunge at her, but he didn't. His face twisted, fear and desperation mingling. He cursed incoherently, kicked the doorstep hard, then bolted across the yard, jumped on his motorcycle, and tore down the street. The engine roared into the dark, leaving only the red trail of the tail light like a streak of blood. When the sound faded completely, I collapsed onto the bedroom floor. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, fast, violent, chaotic. Nothing else could break through it. Ria stayed in the yard, looking in the direction Grant had gone, before lowering her phone. She sighed, long, heavy, then looked up at the window where I stood. I switched on the bedroom light. Ria nodded softly, reassuring, steady. Then she turned and walked home, her steps slow but firm. I closed the curtain, back toward the bed, and broke down. Not just out of fear, but out of shame. Shame that I had let things go this far. I covered my face as tears slipped through my fingers. I had spent my whole life protecting Grant from pain, from mistakes, and now he was the one pushing me to the edge. It took several minutes before I could stand. I walked downstairs and looked at the front door, still bearing the marks of Grant's kicks. There were scratches on the floor, and the air still held the sour trace of his alcohol. I knelt, placed my hand on the cold wood, and asked myself a question that had been forming for a long time. If I don't stand up now, will I survive the week? The answer came immediately, without hesitation, without confusion. No. And for the first time, I didn't deny it. I stood, wiped my tears, and went to find the notebook I'd started when I began collecting evidence. I added a new line, big and bold, to remind myself whenever my resolve weakened, I must protect myself, and I will. That almost fateful night ended in the heavy silence of the whole neighborhood. But for me, nothing ended. It only began. From the moment Grant kicked my door and screamed, "You have to sign," I knew the path ahead would hold no space for hesitation or softness. I had to be stronger, and I would be stronger because I wanted to keep living, not just survive, but live. The morning after that chaotic night, I woke with swollen eyes but an oddly clear mind. Maybe when fear reaches its limit, panic disappears, leaving only the clarity you're forced to have. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, painting the floor in a thin golden strip. I heard birds in the yard and for a moment wished life could return to the calm mornings of years ago. But then the phone rang, the caller ID, Rhea Coleman. I inhaled deeply and answered. "Eleanor, you're awake? I'm coming over." Her voice was steady, calmer than I expected. A few minutes later, a soft knock sounded, nothing like the pounding from the night before. Rhea stood on the porch, holding a large manila envelope. She stepped inside with a serious expression, not wasting any time. "I brought this for you." I opened the envelope. Inside was a USB drive and a printed still frame taken from the video. In the captured image, Grant was kicking my bedroom door, his face twisted in fury, his hand raised as if ready to break it down. Under the yard light, the scene laid the truth bare without needing any explanation. "I uploaded a copy to the cloud in case something happens," Rhea said. "I recorded the entire thing last night, from the moment he pounded on your door to when he sped off." I gripped the paper, my fingers trembling. "Thank you, but I feel so ashamed." Rhea looked at me, her eyes softening. "Eleanor, shame is what abused people often feel, but you didn't do anything wrong. Don't let fear hold you back anymore." I fell silent. Maybe all these years I'd held on to this belief that if I was patient enough, loving enough, Grant would change. But that video, raw, real, undeniable, stripped away the last illusion inside me. That afternoon, I went to the lawyer's office with the USB in hand. Helen, the silver-haired attorney I had met before, opened the video without saying a word. She replayed parts of it several times, studying each gesture, each shout, each violent kick. When she finished watching, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. "Eleanor, this is gold-level evidence." My throat tightened. "You mean it's enough to request a restraining order immediately?" She paused, then added, "And if necessary, it's enough for police to investigate elder abuse." A cold shiver traveled down my spine. I, the mother who once held Grant in my arms the day he was born, was now using phrases like elder abuse to describe my own son. But the lawyer was right. The truth didn't soften just because I wished it would. She placed a form on the desk. "Are you ready to sign?" I looked down at the paper. The words, "Restraining Order Request," printed clearly. Part of me wanted to push it away, to crawl back to the days before Grant became who he was now. But the other part, the part that had been shoved into walls, grabbed by the shirt, threatened and pressured to sign, said, "It's time." I signed. My hand trembled, but the stroke of the pen was firm, and within 24 hours, the court approved a temporary restraining order for 14 days. A town police officer came to deliver the decision. He explained clearly, Grant Whitmore must vacate the property immediately. While the order is in effect, he must stay at least 100 yards away from you and cannot call, text, or contact you by any means. Even though I knew this had to be done, my heart still ached hearing my son's name spoken by a police officer. Grant received the notice that afternoon. I didn't stand close enough to see. The officer told me to stay inside, but through the crack of the door, I saw Grant's silhouette in the yard, his shoulders shaking, his face red. He argued for a moment, then finally threw his bag into the car and drove off. The house fell into a heavy silence once his car disappeared. That evening, while I sat alone in the living room, my phone buzzed. A message from Grant. "Do you really want to do this to me? I just need time to sort everything out. Who put these ideas in your head? Do you want me to die?" I read each message, my heart twisting, but none of them ended with a real apology. Every apology carried a blade. "You know what I'm capable of when I'm cornered." I set the phone down. I didn't respond. A few minutes later, he sent another, "If you don't cancel this order, you'll regret it." I stared at the glowing screen in the dark. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. Maybe I had already lived through the worst pain, the night he kicked my door and screamed, screamed, "You have to sign!" All that remained was resolution. I blocked his number. The moment I pressed the button, it felt like closing a giant door, one I knew I couldn't reopen if I wanted to stay alive. In the days that followed, Grant vanished from town, but his unraveling showed in small ways. Unknown callers who hung up as soon as I answered, a car parked too long outside the house that drove away when I turned on the porch light, but I no longer trembled like before. Not because Grant had become harmless, but because I had something I once lacked: the truth, evidence, the law on my side. I used that time to collect more documents, review copies of Grant's financial records, and organize everything clearly. I worked like someone preparing for court, not to win, but to live. Every time I heard the wind through the window, I remembered that night when I was nearly backed into a corner, and I knew if I hadn't acted, I might not be here sipping morning tea or listening to birds on the porch. I began preparing for the official hearing scheduled in 2 weeks. The court required evidence. I organized Ria's video, the voice recordings, photos of the debt notices, and the original documents I buried under the oak tree. As I placed everything into a black binder, I rested my hand on the cover for a long moment. "This is the path I choose," I whispered, affirming it to myself. No more trembling at the sight of debt papers. No more hesitation at the word sign. No more avoiding the truth. And above all, no more being a mother living in fear. I looked out the window. The sky was lighter. The thick morning clouds had begun to break, letting a gentle glow through. I didn't know what awaited me, but I knew this. I had walked farther than fear, and a small hearing was about to become a turning point in my life. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning at 9. From the moment I entered the town courthouse, my legs felt weak. The long hallway, the cold gray walls, the echo of footsteps made me feel like I was walking into a place that would judge not only Grant, but also all the years I had let things warp while I looked away. Helen walked beside me, reassuring, "Just tell the truth. I'll handle the rest." I nodded, but the hardest part was knowing I would have to speak that truth in front of my son. When I entered the courtroom, I saw Grant sitting on the left bench. His head was bowed, his hands clasped, his clothes wrinkled as though he'd worn them without thinking. His hair was messy, his eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in weeks. A social worker sat beside him, whispering something quietly, but as soon as we walked in, Grant lifted his head. His eyes slid over me, quick but sharp as a blade. Gone was the fear from that night. In its place was something else: anger, disappointment, and the familiar blame. I took a deep breath and sat several rows away. When the judge entered, everyone stood. He was a man in his 60s, tall, stern-looking, but not cold. My stomach tightened, knowing what was about to be laid bare under the bright lights. Grant was asked to speak first. He stood, exhaled shakily, and began speaking in a trembling voice, as if trying to appear fragile. "Your Honor, I don't know why my mother is doing this. I think she's paranoid. She's imagining things that never happened." I clenched my hands in my lap. The word paranoid hit me like a slap. Grant continued, touching a hand to his head. "Thinks she's not well. She might have stumbled into a door and thought I hit her. She forgets things. I'm afraid she's losing her mind or depressed." Every sentence felt like a knife. He didn't shout, didn't break things, didn't rage. He played the weak, suffering victim. A perfectly crafted performance. Then he lowered his head, making his voice crack. "I only want my mother to be safe. I never wanted to hurt her." His lawyer stood and added, "My client has anxiety and recently lost his job. He acted impulsively under stress, not out of malice. We believe Mrs. Eleanor misunderstood." I felt like my chest was being squeezed. After all my years with Grant, I knew when he was being honest and when he was performing. Today, he was performing, a performance so polished that if I were a stranger, I might have believed him. Then it was my turn. I stood, my legs shaky but my voice as steady as I could manage. "I don't want to be here, but I also don't want to die because of my own silence." The courtroom went still. I recounted recounted every incident, every object he threw, every threat he made. Every moment I was too afraid to breathe. When I reached the part where he kicked my door and screamed, "You have to sign," my voice cracked. I had to pause to breathe. Then Helen handed the USB to the court clerk. The video played. On the large screen, Grant appeared kicking the door, red-faced and raging, while Rhea filmed from the yard. Each kick amplified the fear I had lived through. Grant shot to his feet. "That's not fair! She recorded me without permission!" The judge cut him off. "In cases documenting violence, the law allows it." Grant's mouth hung open. He fell back into his seat, pale. I saw panic flicker in his eyes, his performance tearing apart at the seams. The judge leaned forward and studied him. "Do you understand that your actions were severely threatening?" Grant muttered. "I was just upset. I didn't mean intent matters less than impact," the judge said firmly. The air in the room thickened. Grant looked cornered, began breathing harder. Then suddenly, he dropped to his knees in the middle of the courtroom. "Mom, please don't do this to me," he wailed, his voice cracking. "I'm in debt. I have nothing left. If I lose the house, I can't survive." I closed my eyes. Seeing him kneel should have broken my heart. Instead, it filled me with a grief so deep there was no room left for weakness. I said slowly, clearly, "Grant, no house is worth your mother's life." He looked up, eyes wide, as if my words had taken away the last thing he was clinging to. The judge turned to his lawyer. "Does he have any history of violence or alcohol abuse?" The lawyer stammered. "That hasn't been confirmed." The judge nodded, wrote something, then tapped his gavel. "Based on the evidence and testimony, the court rules Grant Whitmore is prohibited from contacting Mrs. Eleanor for 6 months. He must undergo psychological evaluation and mandatory alcohol treatment." I felt like I finally surfaced from underwater after being held down for too long, not because I won, but because at last I could breathe. Grant collapsed into his chair, hollow-eyed. The social worker leaned in to speak to him, but he didn't move. I looked away. I didn't want to see him like that anymore. But something in his eyes before I turned away made my spine go cold. A dangerous, silent calm, as if defeat had hidden something deeper inside him. Outside, Rhea waited for me in the hallway. She took my hand. "You did the right thing." I smiled, though my lips trembled. "I should have done this long ago." Rhea met my eyes. "It is never too late to survive." I squeezed her hand. A small warmth spread through me, the kind of warmth I hadn't felt from Grant in many years. When I stepped into the parking lot, the March wind brushed past me, lifting my hair. I looked up and saw the gray clouds beginning to part, revealing the first soft light after weeks of darkness. I opened the car door, sat inside, and closed my eyes. I used to think the biggest decision of my life was bringing Grant into this world, but today I finally understood. The biggest decision was drawing a boundary to protect myself from the very child I gave birth to. The hearing was only one small step, a single step, but a step I had waited far too long to take, and I knew the story wasn't over because Grant still owed me a truth, one I had waited for my entire remaining life, a truth that surely wouldn't be easy for him to speak. 2 weeks after the hearing, I began growing accustomed to the strange quiet in the house. There were no more heavy footsteps on the stairs, no more remotes slammed on the table, no more half-open beer cans or the heavy alcoholic sighs drifting from the living room. At first, the silence made me uneasy, as if something familiar yet toxic had suddenly vanished. But slowly, that peace seeped into me like warmth returning to a room that had been cold for far too long. I spent most of my time in the backyard watering plants, pulling weeds, and sometimes just sitting by the old oak tree where I buried the documents. Some mornings, I brewed a cup of Earl Grey, sat on the front porch steps, and listened to cars passing by, feeling lighter each time I reminded myself that I no longer had to dread Grant coming home unexpectedly. I thought I would need much more time to recover, but one afternoon, just as I set a bag of groceries on the kitchen counter, my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. Only 4 words. I want to see you. I froze, knowing instantly it was Grant. Another message arrived seconds later. Can you come to the center? I need to talk. Below was the address of the town's alcohol rehab center. I set the phone down, staring at it. A familiar yet unfamiliar feeling washed over me. The instinct to rush toward my child mixed with the cautious distance I had promised myself and my lawyer I would keep. In the end, I called Helen for advice. She said, as long as you go somewhere safe with staff present, it's fine. A restraining order doesn't always prohibit supervised meetings. I sat down, my hands clasped tightly. Strange. I had waited years for a confession from Grant, but now that he wanted to speak, I felt afraid. Afraid that whatever he said would tear apart whatever was left of my heart. But I went. The rehab center sat at the edge of town, a beige building with large glass doors and a modest sign. Inside, it was quiet, filled only with the scent of disinfectant and the soft footsteps of staff. A nurse led me to a supervised meeting room. Glass door in the middle, 2 benches on either side. I sat on the right bench, gripping the edge of my coat. A minute later, Grant walked in. I had to steady my breathing when I saw him. He had lost a noticeable amount of weight. His cheekbones jutted sharply. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale from sleeplessness. Gone were the anger, arrogance, and volatility. He looked tired, like someone who had been walking through storms for years and collapsed on his mother's doorstep. Grant sat down across from me, hands on his knees, not looking up yet. Thank you for coming, he murmured, his voice hoarse. I nodded but didn't interrupt. He needed to speak first. After a long silence, Grant finally raised his head. I owe you an explanation. That simple sentence tightened my chest. It had been so many years since I heard him speak with the voice of a child who once clung to me when he feared the dark. Grant inhaled deeply. I was threatened with death. I froze. My creditor, he continued. I owe a lot, so much that I can't pay it back. He came to the house 3 times. He said if I didn't get the money, then I'd pay with my life. My hands grew cold. Grant clenched his fingers, breathing unevenly as he continued. I panicked. I didn't know what to do, and I thought, if you sign the house over, I could borrow money from the bank, pay everything off, and start over. I stared at him. So, you wanted to trade your mother's life to save your own? Grant lowered his head. I know. I was wrong. My heart felt crushed. Wrong. Of course it was wrong. But the truth went beyond wrong. It was betrayal. It was choosing to push his mother into a pit just to save himself. What were you thinking, Grant? My voice trembled. Did you think I'd sign? Did you think I didn't feel fear? Did you think I didn't know he might kill me? He broke into tears, not loud sobs, but the kind that crushed the chest and made his shoulders shake. I couldn't remember the last time I saw him cry. Perhaps when he was 12, the year he was bullied on the school field and ran home to me, tears streaming down his face. After that year, he never cried again. It was as if he locked away every softness, until now, when it all burst out. I closed my eyes, feeling a deep ache rising from a place I thought was long empty. I never wanted to hurt you, he said between shuddered breaths. I was scared. I felt like the whole world was against me. And I thought, as long as you were here, I still had a way out. I opened my eyes and looked straight at him. Grant, you do not get to risk your mother's life to save your own. Not ever. He nodded, tears dripping onto his hands. I know now. I let a few seconds pass. From now on, I forgive. But I have boundaries. Grant looked up, eyes swollen. What boundaries? Mom, no living together, no touching my money, no using my name for anything, no lying, and no leaning on me to escape the consequences of your life. He nodded immediately, as if terrified I'd take the offer back. I agree. I'll start over. I promise. I didn't answer right away. I looked at him. My son. The person who pushed me to the edge of fear. The person whose footsteps once made me tremble. But also the child I rocked to sleep, walked to school, and comforted after nightmares. Forgiving was something I could do. Forgetting was not. But forgiveness was the only way for both of us to keep living. When the staff announced the session was over, I stood up. Grant rose too, his eyes still red. "Mom," he whispered, "thank you for coming." I lightly touched his arm, not a hug, not drawing him close, just a touch long enough to say I was still here, though not as his unconditional refuge. I turned to leave. Walking down the hallway, I felt my heart grow lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally heard what I needed, the truth. And I had said what I needed. Boundaries. Outside, a breeze carried the scent of pine and soft afternoon sunlight. I inhaled. For the first time in months, I felt like I was walking for myself, not running from something, not fearing what might come. I had heard the confession, and I chose to keep living on my own terms. When I returned home from the rehab center, I sat in the car for a long time. The late afternoon sky wore a pale gold, the last rays of sunlight touching the porch roof, making the wood grain glow. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and wondered, what will life look like from here? I didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain. I couldn't go back to how things were. That evening, I opened every window to let the breeze in. The air felt lighter, cleaner, or maybe it was just my mind, finally no longer imprisoned by fear. I walked through the house, the warm yellow light cast across every object, some still bearing cracks or scratches from Grant's outbursts. I stopped in front of the cabinet door he smashed on that first night, the crack running down like a scar. How long have I lived like this? I asked myself. The answer startled me. Too long. The next morning, I called a handyman. The kitchen cabinets were replaced, the living room got a fresh coat of paint, and I changed every lock on the front door, back door, and storage shed. The handyman asked if I wanted extra security cameras. I simply nodded. I never thought I would need things like that. But now I understood clearly that my safety was never something to be taken lightly. As the house transformed, so did I. I signed up for a Tai Chi class for older adults at the community center. Walking into the room the first time, I felt shy, surrounded by gentle faces, silver hair, kind eyes welcoming me like a new friend. During the first lesson, I moved awkwardly, lifting my hands too high, stepping off rhythm, but as the slow movement synced with my breath, something in me loosened. A white-haired lady beside me smiled. "You're doing great. Everyone's like this the first time." I smiled too, feeling lighter than I had in months. Each day, my body grew stronger. I slept better, startled less at sudden noises. Some mornings, I looked in the mirror and realized my face had brightened, losing the tightness I used to hide under a thin layer of makeup. I spent more time in the garden. The backyard still held the old oak tree where I buried the documents, but now I stood beside it with a different feeling. Not heaviness, but a sense of witnessing my own survival. I planted sunflowers, hydrangeas, and a row of lavender along the walkway. When I watered them, the scent of damp soil and lavender reminded me of my husband, the man who once tended this land with such reverence for life. "I'm continuing what you started," I whispered, as if comforting myself. In that garden, I found the peace I had lost for too long. Rhea visited more often. We drank tea in the backyard, talking about small things. Which flowers bloomed better this year? The spring fair the town was planning, the new neighbors who had just moved in. Once I took her hand and said, "If you hadn't stood in my yard that night, I don't know what would have happened." Rhea squeezed my hand gently. "Eleanor, sometimes we need someone on the outside to remind us we're worth protecting." I smiled, my eyes stinging. Rhea wasn't just a neighbor, she was the person who pulled me out of a night that could have cost me my life. A few weeks later, I met with Helen to update my will. I wasn't wealthy, but this house and the savings from the years my husband was still alive, they were the products of a lifetime. Helen helped me add a clause. My assets could not be transferred by anyone unless approved by the court and an independent supervisor. These terms would protect me from coercion or family abuse. I left the office feeling as if I had built a sturdy fence around my life, something I had never done before. One afternoon, while watering the flowers, I realized I had started using a word I once struggled to say: no. No to unreasonable demands. No to excusing someone else's harm. No to carrying all the blame. No to letting fear decide for me. Strangely, saying no felt far more freeing than saying yes. Every night, I still thought of Grant, not with fear, like before, but with a quiet sadness, a gentler kind of grief. I missed him the way you miss someone you once knew, once loved, who had wandered far off the path. I don't know how much he will truly change. I don't know if he will keep the promise he made in that supervised room, but I do know I did the right thing for him and for myself. When I look in the mirror now, I see a woman who is no longer forced to endure pain just to be considered a good mother. I see someone beginning again, not with youth, but with courage. One night, standing on the porch watching the lavender sway in the wind, I suddenly realized, for the first time in years, I wasn't living in fear that Grant would come home drunk or pound on my door in the middle of the night. I was simply living, truly living. And that, after everything that happened, was the greatest gift I could have given myself. A year can feel long to some and short to others. For me, it was enough time to heal the deepest wounds, and enough to look back on the road I had walked without trembling at the memory. When spring returned to town, pale green leaves covered the small street leading to my house, and I realized I was standing in a place very different from the woman I had been 12 months earlier. In early March, I received a letter from the rehab center confirming that Grant had completed the full 8-month alcohol recovery program. The paper stated, stable condition, cooperative attitude, positive response. I held the letter in my hands, and the feeling wasn't explosive joy, but a quiet, settling relief. I once thought I'd never be able to read my son's name without fear. Yet that day, his name lay printed on the white page, clear, honest, and my hand didn't shake. I simply exhaled, a long breath, but a light one. A few weeks later, Grant reached out again, not with long apologies, not with empty promises like before, just a simple message. Mom, I found a job. A photo came with it, a warehouse belonging to a logistics company in town, where Grant had taken a job loading and unloading goods. Hard work, low pay, but honest, steady, real. I replied, I'm proud of you. Just one sentence, no more, no less. I had learned to keep the boundaries I set. A week later, Grant sent another picture, his new apartment. A single room, old wooden floor, a window overlooking a parking lot. Nothing special, but he wrote, this is my place. I pay for it myself. I read that message under the kitchen light, and tears fell before I even noticed. Not from pain, but from the realization that the son who once leaned on me so heavily, he was willing to drag me into life or death danger, had finally learned to stand on his own feet. Since leaving the center, Grant hasn't asked for anything. No requests for money, no excuses, no vague messages swinging between apology and threat. He hasn't mentioned the house, the bank accounts, or anything tied to his benefit. Instead, we set a new rule. We meet only once a month in public, a small cafe downtown. Warm lights, soft chatter, the smell of coffee drifting through the air. A place without resentment, without shadows, without the heavy history built into our walls. The first time I saw him there, I almost didn't recognize him. His hair was trimmed neatly, his face clean shaven, his light blue shirt buttoned all the way, and his eyes no longer dull or lost. When he walked in, a few employees nodded at him, as if to say he wasn't a burden where he worked. He sat down, hands wrapped around the cup, and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled, but kept enough distance so he wouldn't misread it. "I can help, but I won't carry everything for you." He nodded, without arguing, without tensing up. The conversation lasted only about 30 minutes, but it was enough for me to realize our new relationship, though distant, was healthier, lighter, true. Rhea understood my transformation better than anyone. She visited every Sunday afternoon with a warm apple pie, because no friend should eat alone, she always said. We sat in the garden, the sun still warm, the breeze rustling the lavender beneath our feet. "You're different now, Eleanor," she said one afternoon. "A year ago, you couldn't raise your voice in front of your son. Now you stand tall and know you deserve peace." I smiled, my chest filling with a quiet gratitude. If Rhea hadn't turned on her porch light that night, hadn't lifted her phone, hadn't called the police, I wouldn't have today. Sometimes I reflect. Some people enter our lives not to replace anyone, but to remind us we deserve better. One afternoon in April, I updated my will. Attorney Helen carefully typed every clause, from property to inheritance. But there was one condition I insisted she put clearly: protection of assets from family abuse or coercion, meaning anyone who hopes to inherit, Grant included, must meet one requirement: no threats, no coercion, no forced signatures, no violence. Helen nodded with a small smile. "This is the will of someone who knows her worth." I smiled back. It took me too long to learn that. And I learned something important. Saying no is not rejecting love. It is protecting yourself from love that has been twisted. I began setting boundaries in every part of my life, not just with Grant. I no longer did chores for neighbors out of guilt, no longer tried to please everyone, no longer forced myself to fit the mold of a perfect mother society once demanded. I learned to put myself first, and strangely, the world didn't collapse the way I once feared it would. A year passed. I stood before the bathroom mirror, looking at my reflection. My hair was grayer, my wrinkles deeper, but in my eyes was a steadiness, a clarity, a self-possession I had never seen before. I touched my face lightly and smiled. At last, I've come back to myself. On the dining table sat a small frame beside a jar of dried lavender. In the photo were Grant and me, taken one afternoon when he was a giggling toddler, so carefree I could hardly believe we would one day drift so painfully far apart. I haven't forgotten what happened. I never will, but it no longer controls me. I picked up my warm cup of tea and stepped into the backyard. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering onto the patio in shimmering dots that danced with every breeze. I sat on the old wooden chair my husband built, closed my eyes, and breathed in the faint lavender scent in the air. When I opened my eyes, I looked toward the gate. The future was still blurry, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I had survived. I had changed, and I was rewriting my life, one page at a time. A year ago, I was trembling in the dark. Today, I am standing in the light, and this is only the beginning. On an early summer morning, as sunlight sliced through the cracked blinds and birds chattered in the oak behind the house, I stepped onto the porch with a hot cup of tea. My heart felt as light as a leaf freed from a storm. I sat on the wooden chair my husband once built, leaned back and let the memories of the past year drift across my mind, not heavy anymore, but like a film that had reached its final scene, one I could now watch with a calm I once believed was impossible. I looked back on the path I had walked as if looking back on my entire life. There were stretches so dark I could no longer tell where the pain ended and the breathing began. There were days I thought I had lost my son forever. There were nights I sat by my bedroom door, clutching my phone but unable to dial the police because my heart clung to one fragile thing: hope. The hope that Grant would return to me as he once was, the little boy who ran into the kitchen begging for apple pie. But love does not mean enduring without conditions. It took nearly a lifetime for me to understand that. Love does not mean ignoring harm. It does not mean staying silent while being mistreated. It does not mean giving until you are empty. And most of all, love must never require you to risk your safety, dignity, or life. I learned that sometimes, to save your family, you must walk away first, not to give up, but to remind everyone, yourself included, that love is not a pass for endless hurt. I am grateful for Rhea, the woman who stood in my yard that night, armed with nothing but a phone and her courage. She didn't just save me from a breaking door. She helped me face a truth I had buried for far too long. But above all, I am grateful to myself, grateful to the woman who trembled in her bedroom yet still held onto her phone, grateful to the woman who gathered every piece of evidence, even when each piece felt like a wound, Grateful to the woman who signed that restraining order, even when her hand shook so hard she could barely hold the pen. Grateful to the woman who learned to stand, not to defeat her son, but to save both of them from the abyss he was falling into. Today, Grant is a different person. Not perfect, not magically transformed into a devoted, flawless son, but real and trying. He works, lives on his own money, visits me once a month without asking for anything. He is grateful, not because I forgave him, but because I dared to build boundaries that allow us both to exist as separate, whole individuals. We both stepped out of the darkness, but on separate paths. The difference is, for the first time in my life, I'm not walking behind him. I'm walking beside myself. If someone reading this sees a part of their own life in mine, I want them to know one thing. You are not alone. No one deserves to suffer in silence. No one is born to become a trembling shadow in their own home. Truth may hurt. It may tear apart what you tried so hard to hold together. But truth is the only thing that can save you from a life you were never meant to endure. And sometimes all it takes is one person standing under a porch light saying they've seen you, heard you, and called for help. For your life to turn onto a different path. I'm not writing this to complain nor to claim credit. I'm writing to speak to someone out there, maybe you, quietly listening to my story from start to finish. Life can begin again at any age, even at an age when you think it's too late to change. I was wrong. No one is ever too late, only too afraid. I used to be that way, and I walked through it. If you've stayed with me until this final line, thank you, truly. People our age often need nothing more than a gentle voice, a real story, a companion who understands the things no one else sees. If you're still listening, and if any part of your life echoes mine, please tell me where you're watching. From just one comment is enough for me to know I didn't tell this story alone. And if you'd like to walk with me through more journeys like this, feel free to leave a comment. Follow or like this video, not for the algorithm, but so I know my story has reached you. I treasure every minute you've shared with me today, and from the bottom of my heart, I wish you, whoever you are, peace, strength, and freedom in your own life, just as I, at last, have found my way back to mine.